Good afternoon. I'm talking to Dr. Stephanie Seneff, PhD. She is a senior research scientist at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. She has a bachelor degree in biology with a minor in food and nutrition, a master's degree and engineering degree and a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science, all from MIT. She has authored over 36 peer-reviewed journal papers on topics relating to human disease, nutritional deficiencies, and toxic exposures. She has focused specifically on the herbicide glyphosate and the mineral sulfur. Dr. Seneff splits the time equally between two homes in Hawaii and Massachusetts. She is the author of the book Toxic Legacy: How the Weed Killer Glyphosate is Destroying Our Health and the Environment. And the book was published by Chelsea Green Publishing in July 2021. Dr. Seneff, welcome and thank you very much for taking time to talk to me today.
I'm delighted to be here. Thank you.
Stephanie, you were exposed to glyphosate by Dr. Don Huber in 2012, I think it was. Can you,
yes.
Can you please tell us a bit about the history about glyphosate?
Yes, well, glyphosate it is an herbicide, so it actually kills all plants except those that have been engineered to resist it. It was patented around, I think, 1968 or something by Monsanto as an herbicide, and it was introduced in the American market around 1974. It was available for farming and also for residential use. Its use has gone up dramatically since about 2000, and that's because of the introduction of the genetically modified Roundup-ready crops. So there were several major crops that they figured out how to insert a bacterial gene into the crop using genetic engineering technology, and that protected the crop from glyphosate, so they could just spray the crop without worrying about it dying, and that made farming much more efficient, much cheaper, and much less labor. And it was heralded as a breakthrough in agriculture. And so over that decade after they started rolling out these GMO crops, corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, cotton, those are all crops that have this GMO technology that allows them to be sprayed with glyphosate without dying. And those crops then have become the major crops of the processed food industry, many of them. And the growth in the use of glyphosate was exponential during that first decade of this century because there was, as they used the Roundup, the weeds became resistant, so they had to use more and more to kill the weeds over time. So the usage went way up, and it became clear to me that it was toxic around about 2007, which was, actually around 2012 was when I first realized that it was. I think it's the primary cause of a great number of chronic diseases that we're facing in this country and increasingly around the world as other countries adopt the Western diet with the processed foods that have high levels of glyphosate in them. So we have an obesity epidemic and Alzheimer's and autism and fatty liver disease and diabetes, all these different chronic diseases that we're struggling with today. I think glyphosate's a major player as a causal factor.
Can you just give a bit of a background as well on glyphosate and the effect that it has on soil, and specifically the soil life, the biology in the soil? As far as I can recall in your book, you mentioned a study on earthworms specifically, because I think, and why I'm highlighting earthworms, the biology, and that is also, you can go into that, but why I'm highlighting earthworms is because that's often a marker for the farmers where they say, well, if I find an earthworm or so many earthworms per spade, I'm actually getting somewhere. Also in the regenerative agricultural spectrum or the conservative agriculture, conservation agriculture. If you could just elaborate a bit on that as well.
Yes, I mean, the earthworms are actually a very good indicator, too, of what they might be doing to us. And there have been some very interesting studies on earthworms, and one in particular that I think I wrote about quite a bit in my book, where they were using the herbicide and they expected the earthworms to come to the surface of the soil to eat the decaying food that was, the plant was being poisoned by glyphosate, and that was providing raw material for the earthworms to eat, and they expected them to come up and eat that. And they found out that what happened was the earthworms basically got paralyzed. They weren't coming to the surface the way they should be because they got paralyzed. And so they lost their motility. And in fact, other studies have shown that glyphosate causes a Parkinsonian-like syndrome in earthworms. And glyphosate has also been linked to Parkinson's disease in farmers. There's a statistical correlation between using glyphosate in agriculture and developing Parkinson's disease. And so the earthworms, of course, are very, very important for soil health. They do a lot. They eat stuff and they digest it, and their poop is actually nutritious for the soil. So they're basically accelerating the rate at which food residue becomes soil. They're really helping, and they're also aerating the soil because they roam around in there and they make it, they provide the oxygen. So the earthworms are really, really important for soil health, and the earthworms are getting killed by the glyphosate.
If you want to just mention also, I mean, and now this is probably where glyphosate also as a chelator plays such a major role, because I think that is where we actually lose the plot. We don't realize as farmers sometimes and as how many effects or what glyphosate was actually patented for. If you take a chelator, it was an antibiotic and it's patented for a herbicide. Both the effects as an antibiotic on the soil microbiome and also as a chelator.
Right. Yes, the chelation is important, and that was one of the things that so Professor Don Huber had presented this 2-hour presentation back in 2012, which was when I first picked up on the idea that glyphosate might be a causal factor in autism. And one of the things that he pointed out, and he had slides to show it, he had done studies, and he had shown that when the plants are exposed to glyphosate in the soil, the minerals don't get taken up at much, much lower levels of minerals showed up in the plants. These included things like magnesium and zinc and copper and sulfur. So sulfur was way down, and that was one that was important to me because I've been studying sulfur and its roles in the body, and I've been aware that sulfur deficiency is linked to autism. So I was particularly interested in this aspect of the sulfur not getting taken up by the plants because glyphosate is a very, very strong metal chelator, especially what they call +2 cations, which are many of those important nutrients that we need. And we need them in microscopic amounts, but they're critical for our enzymes to work properly. Manganese, cobalt, magnesium, zinc, all those minerals that are so important for both the soil health, the plant health, and our health are being glyphosate binds to them so strongly that the microbes can't get at them. And glyphosate also kills the microbes in the soil, and it kills the microbes in the gut. And I think that is a major component of its toxicity, that it disrupts the soil microbiome balance and it disrupts the gut microbiome balance in the same way.
I think the other thing, the problem with the chemicals and it's not only glyphosate now, but also antibiotics in general. If you take the antibiotic resistance in both humans and also animal husbandry already, or in animal production, is that the pathogens often become resistant, and the normal flora that actually is there to help or to make the system more robust actually can't survive it. And
right.
You've touched a bit on it on the microbiome, on glyphosate on the human side, and the endocrine disrupt. If you talk about the glyphosate and the human health, both on the endocrine disruption, the carcinogen, and also chronic diseases. I mean, you've touched on Parkinson's, you've touched on autism, and that. Can you elaborate a bit on that? And you can bring in if you can also, you speak a lot in your book about glycine and the role glyphosate has with glycine and the protein production in that, because that also has a direct effect again on your immune system and systems, your protein synthesis systems and that. So you now have time. The floor is yours, because I think this is now the human side is so much more critical. And what we do to our soils is the start of it. But what we have actually done to our human side, on the human health side of it, from the whole system, I mean, if we're talking endocrine, carcinogens, and chronic diseases, it's actually frightening what we are doing with ourselves with our current conventional food system.
Right, yes, that's quite a bit that you covered there, and that's, I think, really, really important. And I want to emphasize the fact that the glyphosate, it went through the regulatory process way back when, like 1970s. EPA approved it, Monsanto did a lot of sleazy things to get past the approval process in terms of defining how to study it, and they managed to miss the critical points that this stuff is really toxic. And so we've been taught that it's a wonderful herbicide because it kills all plants except those that have been engineered to resist it, but it's completely harmless to humans. This is what we're told, and this is what people mostly believe. And so to be told that it's not harmless to humans is, for many people, that's such a disconnect with their belief system that they refuse to believe that that's true. So this is a problem we have with convincing people that glyphosate is toxic. And it also is in our food in large amounts, certainly in the United States, and our government doesn't bother to test how much is in the food because they consider it to be perfectly safe. But many organizations have tested and have found high levels of glyphosate in foods that are very commonly eaten by children. So the children are getting a lot of exposure. So I want to emphasize those two facts, that it's much more toxic than we think it is. It's pervasive. And we use it carelessly because we think it's safe. Those are all really bad things that are helping to contribute to the bad outcomes that we're seeing in people who are exposed to it. The glycine aspect is really, really interesting. And I really find the chemistry fascinating, the biochemistry of glyphosate. And I believe that it's the case that it is actually substituting for the amino acid glycine during protein synthesis. This is a bit of biology, and most people don't seem to know very much biology, but there's the famous DNA code, Watson and Crick DNA code, that is the code of life. It's a 4-letter code, and you read off the 3 letters at a time to map to a particular amino acid. And there's about 20 amino acids that are assembled like beads on a string to make a protein. And the proteins are the workhorses of the body. They're the enzymes, the transmitters, they transport minerals across the cell membrane. They're structural. I mean, they're amazing what all the proteins can do. And various enzymes have, as I said, critical dependencies on metals that are not being properly delivered because of glyphosate disrupting the mineral system. But I think the glycine analog aspect is particularly interesting and particularly damaging. And what's happening is that glyphosate is being mistaken for the amino acid glycine during protein synthesis. And so you're assembling your beads on a string, you need a glycine. Instead of glycine, you put glyphosate. And glyphosate has extra material stuck on its nitrogen atom, which messes up the way the protein behaves. It can mess up the way it folds. It can mess up its ability to attach to its substrate. It can basically clobber an enzyme. It could clobber, for example, myosin, the muscle contractile protein. It's been shown in studies there's a 1-glycine in that protein. If you substitute a negatively charged bulkier amino acid, which is what glyphosate is, that protein becomes dead in the water. Like it can only contract at 1 or 2% of its capacity. So I think we're getting paralysis of the gut from the glyphosate exposure. That's causing a lot of problems with digestion because digestion's backing up, and then you get small intestinal bacterial overgrowth because the feces are hanging out, the materials are hanging out up high. They're not moving fast enough through the digestive system. And you get a really disrupted gut situation because of that. So it affects, there's a critical enzyme in the liver. There's actually several enzymes in the liver that get disrupted by glyphosate. There's a whole class called cytochrome P450 enzymes. And those are really important for many things. They activate vitamin D, they create bile acids, they detox a whole bunch of fat-soluble toxic chemicals. And those enzymes are suppressed by glyphosate. That's been shown in multiple studies. And so that's a critical way in which it disrupts the liver. I think it also disrupts an enzyme called PEPCK, phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. That enzyme actually matches perfectly with the model for how it disrupts the enzyme in the shikimate pathway. That's the famous enzyme that's disrupted by glyphosate to kill the plants. This is something that is well known. There's several papers that have been written about the particular enzyme that gets hit hard by glyphosate in the plants. It's in a biological pathway that human cells don't have. So there's an argument that says glyphosate is safe for us because we don't have the biological pathway that glyphosate disrupts in the plants. And the problem, of course, a problem is that our gut microbes do have that pathway. They use that pathway to produce critical nutrients for us because the pathway that it blocks in the gut microbes produces the aromatic amino acids. And those are 3 of the coding amino acids that go into the protein synthesis. So we get deficiencies in the aromatic amino acids because that pathway is broken. But the enzyme that it breaks has a particular setup of a highly conserved glycine at a place where it binds phosphate in PEP. And that glycine gets substituted by glyphosate and prevents it from binding to the phosphate in PEP. And that's what disrupts that enzyme. That's known in studies that that glycine is critical. If you get rid of that glycine, change it to alanine, the protein is completely insensitive to glyphosate. And that's how they made the GMO crops. They got rid of that glycine at that place where it binds phosphate. This is a critical part of the story that I emphasize in my book, because it means that you can look at other enzymes that bind phosphate at places where there are glycines, very, very specific, and you can predict which other enzymes it's going to affect. And then you can see in the literature that it does affect many of those enzymes that you would have identified. So there's a giant puzzle to figure out. But when you do that, it's quite spectacular, the results that you realize, because then you can find that enzymes whose defects are known to be associated with certain diseases, like glyphosate would cause those defects because they have the setup that would be sensitive to glyphosate. And then those diseases are going up in prevalence exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. You put all those puzzle pieces together, and it helps you to explain exactly how glyphosate is causing those diseases. And that works extremely well for autism, Alzheimer's, fatty liver disease. This PEPCK is critical. If it's disrupted, you get fatty liver disease. And glyphosate has been shown to cause fatty liver disease, both in humans. Well, there's been a correlation. There was a study on fatty liver disease in humans. First of all, we have an epidemic in the United States in fatty liver disease. And there was a study where they had a population of people who had fatty liver disease, and they divided them into two groups, more severe disease and less severe disease. And then they had a control group that didn't have it. And they found that the level of glyphosate in the urine was statistically significantly different among all three groups. In other words, the ones who had the worst disease had the most glyphosate in their urine. So that's a correlation. It hasn't proven that the glyphosate has caused it, but it's quite interesting to see that. There's also been a study on women, pregnant women, that showed that they looked at glyphosate in the urine during pregnancy. And I think it was towards the end of pregnancy. They measured the glyphosate in the urine, and they found that it had an effect, that it was correlated with a defect in the girl babies of those women that was an indicator of a excess testosterone exposure in utero. There's a measure you can use on girl babies that they know is an indicator of having been exposed to too much testosterone during pregnancy. And testosterone gets converted to estrogen by an enzyme that's a member of that cytochrome P450 class. So it makes sense that glyphosate would cause excess testosterone in the brain. And these girls had the symptom that you would expect to see if they did. And the bad news is those girls have a much higher risk of something called polycystic ovary syndrome when they grow up. Something like a 12-fold increased risk if you have this feature that indicates testosterone exposure in utero. Those girls have a 12-fold increased risk to polycystic ovary syndrome, which is the most common cause of female infertility. It often is associated with irregular periods and excess hair. It's sort of a male-like, dominance of the sex hormones. The sex hormones are messed up. And the interesting thing is that excess testosterone in utero is also linked to autism in the boys. So that's another link to glyphosate's association with autism. It causes excess testosterone because it blocks an enzyme, which is a cytochrome P450 enzyme, and that causes these effects that lead to problems later in life.
It is actually frightening, eh? It's I mean, it's not only glyphosate. It's a whole chemical industry, and our food preparation industry that is to blame. That glyphosate is part. I think glyphosate, to a certain extent, is its own worst enemy, because it's used so much. It's used over extensively. I mean, I know I read your cover of the book just now, and I mean they use over 300 million pounds yearly, which is, it's scary. I mean, it is, and right. I think the other thing
that's just in the United States too. That's just in the United States.
And I mean, what is also scary is that for a long time, since the Green Revolution or whatever, on nitrogen and everything like that as well, and inorganic fertilizers, is that agronomists have forgotten the biology both in the soil and humans as well, and our microbiome. Everything in our microbiome, the effects it has on our lungs, the effects that it has on our serotonin levels, on our wouldn't say cognitive, but our psyche and that. There's more and more indications that the healthier your gut microbiome is, the healthier the individual is. And we had forgotten that with our food preparation systems by killing everything. I think one big issue is that we've tried to sterilize everything. We've got such a reductive mindset. Right. We've got such a reductive mindset on trying to kill all the parasites and herbicides, after the weeds and pests and that. But nature is always in balance. And I've got it down as a solutions later, as what is the solution? And really, we have to get back to robustness. We can't, this hand sterilization that we have to do because of COVID doesn't bring anything. Wash your hands, don't pick your nose, and that goes far in not transmitting it. But yeah, now specifically on the immune system, also on the COVID and that COVID-19 and the effects, especially on the countries that really can't get it under control because of, one reason would probably be the agricultural systems in that. Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, it's quite fascinating because I picked up on that right away when COVID first showed up. I started to suspect glyphosate right away, and I've been watching the whole time which countries are having a hard time controlling COVID, which ones are doing fine. And you see a very striking pattern. The countries that are having the worst problems with COVID-19 are pretty systematically the same countries that use the most glyphosate in agriculture. Brazil, United States, United Kingdom, much of Europe, those are all heavy glyphosate users with inability to control COVID-19. Whereas if you look at Taiwan or especially Bhutan is amazing because that's a country that has mostly small farms that don't use chemicals. They're just naturally organic small farms. And they have almost no deaths from COVID. They just don't seem to have a problem with COVID at all. And I wrote a whole chapter in my book on the immune system, and I explained how I think glyphosate is disrupting the immune system. And I think what's happening is that our innate immune system is unable to efficiently clear microbes that infect us, and they get out of hand because of that. And then we have to bring in the adaptive immune system, and we have to be overzealous with producing all these antibodies. If you have a healthy innate immune system, you can get COVID, have a mild case, recover, maybe even no symptoms, no antibodies. You don't even develop antibodies to the virus. You don't need them because your immune system can conquer the virus without them. In fact, it's been shown with COVID-19 that the high antibody titers are produced by the people who are the most sick. People who have mild disease end up with low levels of antibodies to the spike protein. People with severe disease have high levels of antibodies. And people who get vaccinated have extremely high levels of antibodies because the vaccine fools the system into thinking that the innate immune system is completely broken. And it's intentional because they want you to produce tons of antibodies in order to protect you from the disease with the vaccine. But it's all quite interesting.
I think it's again our whole mindset about sterilizing everything as well, and it's having a normal flora in and around you, playing in dirt as a child, where certain bacteria, and Dr. Christine Jones speaks a lot about it in soil under quorum. There's a quorum of bacteria that actually then stimulate or express genes. So they do gene expression in the host. And I think that is what we, to a big extent, are missing with our sterile environment. That certain genes aren't stimulated or switched on because we live so sterile and because our food system is so sterile. If you take any fast food burger or piece meal, the thing they want to prevent is that you don't get diarrhea. No one must get sick, but they don't get nutritional food either.
Right. Yes, I think the processed foods are interesting because there's this concept of breaking the foods down into proteins, fats, and carbs, right? Just those three basic food types, proteins, fats, and carbs, missing out on all the really fascinating molecules that plants naturally produce in their own defense system. They produce all kinds of interesting antioxidants, polyphenols, flavonoids, terpenoids. These are all really, benzene. They're basically complicated looking molecules that plants produce for their own health. And then if we eat the whole plant, we pick up all of those molecules and we're able to use them ourselves as antioxidant defenses. And so increasingly people don't eat plants. They eat soy protein bars and potato chips. They're eating things that aren't really natural foods. Even you look at the ingredients of a soy protein bar, and it's a huge list, and there's a whole bunch of things that look like chemicals. It's not really a food anymore, but they're able to kind of put in flavors and whatnot to make it tasty, even artificial flavors. So the foods are very far away from natural foods. I think a crucial thing is just to go back to eating whole foods naturally produced without chemicals. If you just do that one thing, I think your health will improve. Anybody who's eating a processed food diet, if they switch to a healthy organic food diet, whole foods, their health will improve. I'm almost certain that that's the case. Their health will improve.
Yeah, I also think, it's just the residue of all the chemicals that we get in any case that our liver has to constantly discard so that we can actually just stay alive. And I think eating whole food makes a huge difference in that whole process.
Yes.
Glyphosate and the effects on the environment, the wildlife, the biodiversity, and you also talk about it in your book on the contamination of the waterways, especially on your blue algae. I'm missing the name now. Sorry. It is not only glyphosate, and I think it's the whole industry of inorganic fertilizers. If you look at the dead zones in the oceans of nitrogen caused by excess nitrogen.
Right, and in fact, I'd like to say that glyphosate disrupts the uptake of nitrogen into the plants, and so you end up using a lot more nitrogen fertilizer than you would need because of the plant's inability to take it up. It messes up the microbes, the nitrogen-fixing microbes get messed up by the glyphosate. So more of the nitrogen gets washed off into the waterways, and that causes all kinds of problems with the algae, the toxic algae overgrowth, and the cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria are very interesting because there's been a big problem in multiple places in the United States, and particularly Florida is one that's gotten a lot of attention with excess cyanobacteria. That's the blue-green algae. They're called blue-green algae, but they're actually bacteria, cyanobacteria. They're very interesting because they can fully metabolize glyphosate and use its phosphorus as a source of phosphorus. And so they thrive in a glyphosate environment. And they also clear the glyphosate, which is the good news. But they end up they really mess up the whole ecosystem when you have too many cyanobacteria. And that's how you get this, you get overgrowth of these toxic algae. The red tide, they get a lot of problems with toxic things being released as a consequence of this overgrowth of cyanobacteria, which are thriving because they can break down glyphosate. And that's caused devastation. For example, in the Florida Keys, the manatees in Florida are dying in record numbers this year, actually. The manatees are a really interesting animal. They're really cute, and they're being clobbered by the glyphosate. The dolphins are getting Alzheimer's disease in Florida. So there's just a real mess with the ecosystem in Florida, in our country, with heavy use of glyphosate there's a sugarcane agriculture that uses glyphosate, and of course the people who have these beautiful homes, they use glyphosate to control the weeds in their yard, and then they're using glyphosate to control the weeds in the waterways. They have some invasive weeds that they use glyphosate in the water to kill those weeds, and so they've just got a tremendous exposure to glyphosate in the waterways in Florida that is really, really messing up what was a really interesting ecosystem with the Everglades. The Everglades are this really intricate waterway that's sort of almost marshlands that used to have all kinds of animals and plants thriving in it, and it's just becoming devastated by the glyphosate and the other chemicals that they're using.
I actually want to return to endocrine disruptions because it's often taught also under the dietitians, in the dietitian courses and that as well, that glyphosate is safe. And that it's a numbers game. So the more you get in, the better chance you have of getting cancer or having a carcinogen in. I think what they don't understand really on the endocrine disruption side of it is that it's parts per trillion and not necessarily parts per million. That actually, where it acts as a hormone. If you could actually just go elaborate a bit on just what makes an endocrine disruptor so deadly.
Right, those are very interesting, and there are many toxic chemicals that they have found to be endocrine disruptors, and they're remarkable because they're much more toxic at very low doses than they are at higher doses. And one of the things that Monsanto figured out, I think they maybe figured out that glyphosate was more toxic at low doses, and they made a decision way back when that you don't have to test it at the low dose if you can show that the high dose is not toxic. And they also made a decision that you only have to look for 3 months. If you're looking for animal toxicity and you don't see it after 3 months, you're good to go. So they did those two tricks to hide the fact that glyphosate is toxic at low doses, and it is also a slow kill. So it takes more than 3 months to start to see evidence. And there was actually a breakthrough, I think, when Sterility and his team published a paper in 2012 where they did a long-term study. They exposed rats to glyphosate over their entire lifespan at low dose. And at 3 months, the rats seemed fine. They couldn't see any obvious difference between them and the control rats. At 4 months, they started to have problems. By the end of their life, the females had massive mammary tumors. The males had kidney damage and liver damage. Both genders were affected. The reproductive system was affected, and they had early death. And so it was clear that they were having serious problems from the glyphosate at low dosage over the entire lifespan. And that was kind of a breakthrough after 2012. There followed many other papers. In fact, especially recently, in the last few years, many papers have been coming out showing glyphosate toxicity at very low levels, and even in very fascinating papers that are exposing pregnant rodents, like pregnant mice, to glyphosate at very low dosage during a critical period of development for the fetus. And then looking at and the female mouse doesn't have any obvious effects of the glyphosate, but then they look at the pups. The pups also seem to be fine, and then they grow up and they have pups, and those pups you start to see problems, and then they grow up and they have pups, and those pups have even more problems. It's very, very interesting that it affects the germline. So it really, the germ cells in the fetus, which are the next generation, are very sensitive to toxic chemicals at critical periods during development, and they have a memory effect. It's called epigenetics that changes. That they remember that effect of that chemical, and then they use it to modify how development takes place, and you end up with diseases in later generations as a consequence to low dose exposure of the great grandmother, for example. It's quite remarkable, and that's very disturbing, because if that's going to be true for humans as well, it's already too late. I mean, right now, anybody getting pregnant now, exposed to glyphosate, then their great grandchildren are going to be affected by that exposure. Even if it disappeared from then on, they would still be affected from that early exposure.
I mean, that's 80 years, yeah, it is amazing, and I think it's a warning that no one heeds, or not very few, and it's something that really has to be exposed, that it is a glyphosate, that it is an endocrine disruptor. I mean, it's in the book Our Stolen Future, they just talk about PCBs, and what's interesting, it's always the same companies that actually are the cause of these endocrine disruptors and it's somewhere along the line, some accountability must actually happen.
Right. It's really quite amazing, all these chemicals that we're exposed to, and more all the time. I really feel sad about the current generation of children, especially the future generations of children, if we keep this up. It's quite disturbing. We already have a very high rate of various chronic diseases among our children here in the United States. More than half of the kids have some kind of chronic disease.
Yeah, it's scary. It is really, it's frightening. And I mean, if you take it on human fertility and that as well, how the sperm count has dropped over the last 40 years.
Yeah,
I mean, it is
quite remarkable.
Yeah, it is remarkable, and it is something that we really have to take cognizance of, that we have to do things better, and we can. I mean, we're in the 21st century.
Right. If we can just recognize that we need to, I think we can have the motivation to do it, and we should just do it. I mean, it will be so much nicer. I feel sad that everyone is so sick. I mean, right now in America, it's just really sad. You go to the airport and you've got people in wheelchairs or with a walker. You can see lots and lots of people are in pain when they're walking. There's a huge amount of chronic pain, and I think a lot of that is glyphosate, because glyphosate, if it gets into proteins in place of glycine, collagen is the most common protein in the body, and it makes up the joints and the bones, and the skin. I mean, it's a very, very pervasive protein in the body. Collagen has a long, long sequence of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine. It forms a beautiful crystal structure called a triple helix crystal that gives it its special properties of, its flexibility and its tensile strength, its ability to hold water. All of those things get disrupted when you start throwing glyphosate in place of those glycines at random places. It's been shown that people who have mutations in just one glycine in collagen can have severe diseases, having to do with bones and joints. So we have a huge problem with chronic pain in this country. So many people have, aching shoulder or knee surgery, hip replacement surgery, back pain, just tremendous amounts of people in pain, taking pain meds, often taking opioid drugs and getting addicted to them. We have an epidemic in opioid drug addiction, which is killing people. I mean, we just have so many problems in this country right now. It's really depressing.
Yeah, and it's what is depressing is that a certain bunch of shareholders or whatever are actually making money out of it, and with no accountability whatsoever to the end user. It is scary.
Right.
I'm ending the talk with that Don Huber quote on the Historia. You probably know it, but I'll read it at the end. Mm-hmm. It is obvious that glyphosate is an issue, and the use of GMO, genetically modified organisms and food specifically gave the rise to the excessive use of glyphosate. Can we talk a bit on the GMO, and especially that this whole story that they've actually spun that GMO seeds are natural, that it would have happened in nature as well? Because I think that is where the lie actually starts.
Yeah, GMO is certainly way out there. It's not natural at all. You just basically take a bacterial gene and stick it inside a corn seed. It's just completely not natural, and it's hard to know exactly what the consequences of that might be. But I think the part that they really missed out on with the GMOs that allowed the plant to be exposed to glyphosate, when they evaluated the safety of those GMOs, they grew those plants organically. They did not expose them to glyphosate. And then they tested the crop to see if it was safe. That is absolutely stupid, because the whole point of the GMO is to allow you to use the glyphosate. And so they didn't test it in the natural environment in which it would have been used in the crop, where you would have had glyphosate on top of the crop. And so glyphosate is going to disrupt the proteins in that plant, many of the proteins, the same way as it does ours. And so the plant is going to, for example, the plant will be impaired in its ability to make a lot of those antioxidants, those useful fancy molecules that plants make. They can't make them as well because they come out of that shikimate pathway, those antioxidants that are produced by the plants that are so healthy, things like quercetin, and resveratrol. There are all these names for it's a huge list of these interesting plant-based molecules that are very healthy for you, but that they depend upon the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. So if the crop was exposed to glyphosate in the test, they would have seen a very, very different makeup of the crop's proteins as a consequence of the glyphosate exposure, which of course it's going to be exposed to glyphosate in usage, because that's the whole point of the GMO, is to make it resistant. And there's other GMOs that introduce a toxic, they allow the plant to make Bt toxin, which is normally made by a microbe. And so the plant gets that gene to make that Bt toxin, and then that toxin kills the insects. And this is an insecticide resistance that they give to crops. That's another common GMO, the Bt toxin gene, which allows the plant to make the toxin. But then, of course, we eat the toxin, and we even eat the gene that allows you to make the toxin, which our microbes could pick up on. I don't know, it's possible that, because microbes share genes, and so it's possible that they could end up with the Bt toxin in the microbes in your gut, and that would be a really, really big problem if that happened. That your gut microbes would be able to make this Bt toxin, that they learned how to do it because of the plants that had been engineered to have that in their genome. The other thing I'm really worried about is CRISPR, the CRISPR technology, which is a new technology that they're claiming is better than GMO, and it's actually very, they claim it's very precision, but it's not. They're finding in studies that it's not. But the idea is that CRISPR can be programmed to break a DNA molecule at a specific spot, and then they can use it actually to make glyphosate-resistant crops. So they can actually make a plant, and there's papers that show that have that glyphosate resistance gene by actually going in and editing their own shikimate pathway protein, that EPSP synthase, editing the protein in the plant's own version of the protein, tweaking it to get rid of that glycine so that it will not be sensitive to glyphosate. And I've read a long paper on this topic. I think it was in 2015. This paper was written by Dow Chemical, and they were able to create a version of a crop. I think it was corn, that's resistant to glyphosate, that is quote unquote non-GMO, because they have managed to get the regulators to just agree that CRISPR is not a GMO technology. They're defining it as not being GMO because you actually tweaked the plant's own gene rather than adding some gene from some other animal, like a microbe's gene. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The CRISPR is
Yeah.
able to tweak the plant's own gene to make it resistant to glyphosate by changing that glycine. And then you can sell it as a non-GMO crop, a non-GMO food, by virtue of the fact that you did it through CRISPR instead of through the old GMO technology. CRISPR is also being found to be extremely not precision. They claim it's a precision technique, that you can get exactly what you want to get. But in fact, there are off-target effects, and there are even on-target effects. On-target meaning that it actually did change, it cut at the place you wanted it to cut. But the problem is that when the cut had an effect that was unexpected, that maybe even chops out a huge part of that gene. So they're finding strange things happening. Experimentally, they're finding strange things happening with CRISPR that they did not expect, that have huge consequences in terms of disturbing the genome. And this information has been coming out recently, actually, and the stocks have been falling because of this recent news about CRISPR's lack of precision, that they claimed it was like a precision change, that you could control exactly what you were doing. But that turns out not to be true. In multiple ways, it's not true. So I think CRISPR is going to cause a whole bunch of other new headaches, both because they're going to be able to sell it as a non-GMO crop, a non-GMO food, and because it's going to do some off-target effects that are unpredictable.
It's interesting. The trend over the last 30 years is that anybody that criticizes any biotech advances, especially on the GMO, was ridiculed and told that they are against science. And truth be told, they've always been scientists. And I think that is the great thing about also, if you take Arpad Posty and his wife of the Rowett Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland, that is described in Seeds. Yeah, and it's described very well in the Seeds of Deception book by Jeffrey M. Smith, where they did the potato GMO, where they found that it actually does have an effect. They were ridiculed. Stephen Drucker in Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, how they, both the FDA, how they let industry design the research to actually get it approved, the GMO technology. Carrie Gillam with her whitewash after Johnson's court case, where she got a hold of all that information. The book that she's wrote. It's scary what these people have done. You mentioned Sarah Lenny already and his glyphosate studies in 2012, and now your book, Toxic Legacy. Obviously, you're not immune to the PR of being discredited. Has it been bad?
Well, yes. Well, they certainly want people to believe that I'm a quack or that I'm a nutcase. They definitely want people to believe that I'm not credible. I just go about my business continuing to talk about what I believe in, and continuing to study and continuing to acquire a better understanding of what's going on. And it's, I am fascinated by the human metabolism, the whole system of biology. And I've read extensively on the topic, and I'm beginning to form a a good sense of what's wrong with our health and why it's wrong, and the various factors that have been causing us to be sick, and recognizing that the pharmaceutical industry and the chemical industry more generally, which is, of course, the agrochemical industry, they are really the source of our big troubles. And we've just got, the United States has huge, huge health problems, extremely high medical costs. So many people are in pain all the time, or they have diabetes or obesity or Alzheimer's. There are so many chronic diseases that are debilitating, that we're going, and it's going to get a lot worse, I think, in the future, because we keep on doing more and more, and there's just more and more exposures with no end in sight. And the medical system, meanwhile, makes tons and tons of money because everybody's so sick. People when they're desperate, when they're sick, they'll pay a lot of money to try to get a cure, and mostly that's just take some drugs and get some side effects and don't solve your problem. So it's extremely frustrating for the population that they're so sick and they can't seem to fix the problem, and the pharma just sells them expensive drugs that don't work. People are very, very disillusioned right now with the medical system in the United States, and they should be. If pharma is making tons of money because everybody's so sick, so it works well for them to keep us sick. And it's often the same company, right? Now Monsanto is Bayer, and Bayer sells a whole bunch of pharmaceutical drugs, and meanwhile the glyphosate's making people sick, and so they can just feed them all these drugs, make a lot of money. I'm very cynical about the entire system. It needs to be completely overhauled.
Yeah, I want to quote Einstein now as well, where he says, "The right to search for the truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." And I think that is what has happened, and it's happened with science, and it's happened with the help of the universities and everybody else. And it's not only the ag and pharma industry that has to be overhauled; it's actually our whole education and our university systems as well, where we don't have independent universities anymore. If you take the huge, I think it's called CropLife International. I think I don't know who all belongs to it, but it's a front company for the big ag companies that sponsors, that pays in via the trust funds, and it's also in one of the books that I've mentioned where they actually explain it. Monsanto or Bayer, Dow, they won't pay to the university direct. They actually do it through a front company, and the university is at their mercy.
Right.
I think one big problem with regenerative agriculture, it doesn't make money. In regenerative agriculture and conservation agriculture, it's how can I reduce my input costs. They cannot make the money, but it's something where the farmer has to change, and that's why I've got this discussion with you as well. So just to actually highlight how severe the problem is, because if we take, and it's not only in South Africa, it's in the United States, it's worldwide, where the farmers' input costs have doubled and their profit margins have halved. So they're also at the mercy of these big ag companies, that even our banks, if you listen to our banks and that, they talk about how much is your yield. It's never what is your profit per hectare, what's your yield? And if I've got farmers that have reduced the input costs to such an extent that they won't get production loans, because the bank can't understand how they'll make money, because there's not a spray program of chemicals that will control the weeds. So it's the whole system has to be, the whole system is where big companies are, it's all about the shareholder. They've got to keep the shareholder happy.
So the other thing is that you're destroying the soil as you grow the crop. When you do this chemical-based agriculture, the soil gets worse and worse. The soil erodes. There's no micronutrients in it. The microbes are dead. The worms are dead, and the soil is not providing the nutrition that the plant needs to grow well. And now you have to just use all these, even for the plant to defend itself against insects. If it has adequate nutrition, it can defend itself much better against insects. And so you have to use all these chemicals to kill the insects and to kill the weeds and to kill the fungus, and then you've got a very toxic product, and the people all get sick, and the soil gets sick, and the whole thing is just downhill. It gets worse and worse every year. Regenerative agriculture is so beautiful because it helps to restore the soil, to make the soil healthier. And in the end, you'll be much better off, but you don't see the short term. You're sort of focused on the short term yields at the expense of the future when you grow these chemical-based agriculture.
I mean, I think that is, I mean, it would be also, I think, stupid of us if we would just cut the discussion now and actually say, okay, what must you change? But what is the solution? And I really do think that the solution is a regenerative. If you take the soil, it's a physical property of soil. It's the chemical structure of the chemicals in the soil and the biology. And you ignore any of the three at your own peril. And we've ignored for too long the biology of the soil. So, and that is, I think that is biting us. And it is biting agriculture, that they're at the mercy of the big companies, and at the mercy of their production loans. I think South Africa is one of the few countries that don't get any subsidies from the state. So we've got an unbelievable hostile environment to farm in. It's not like the States or Europe, where you actually get a subsidy from the we don't have crop protection from the state. In Europe, if you do a cover crop, if you do canola or a pollinator strip on some of your fields, they will actually pay you for it. And I mean, we really don't have any subsidies in this country. So, and it's, if the alternative cannot make money for the farmer, it then becomes very difficult to actually give him an alternative. And I think that is one problem that Roundup or glyphosate is. They only believe that solution. It's worked for the last 20 years, and how do I actually change? Changing over to regenerative agriculture and actually going through the dip of going to no-till, starting with cover crops. And we've got a fascinating, I work with a company in the US, Green Cover Seeds, with Dale Strickler. He's one of the agronomists. And we chat quite often. And he says it's very difficult for us in South Africa to actually produce a cover crop or a cover crop, because we've got such a long dry season in winter.
So, that's interesting.
Yeah, and sometimes we've only got a 3 to 4 month rainy season. That is when the cash crops have to produce, and that is our Achilles heel to a certain extent. Every paradise has a snake. So, I mean,
it's a good line.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent it's everything goes about water. But if we don't build up our carbon in our soil, and there are enough books already that if you take Gabe Brown's book, Dirty Soil.
Yes, I read that. That's a great book.
Yeah, David Montgomery's Dirt. I mean, there's a whole lot. You can look at Joe Salatin, Christine Jones, the resource aids from Green Cover Seeds, Alan Savory, Johan Zietsman, Kiss the Ground, all the permaculture books, all the silver pasture books, and that the restoration camp books, and that there are people that are doing it. But how do you do it on 15,000 hectares? That is also, if you do it on 200 acres, you know what, that is relatively easy. That if you all of a sudden have to do it on 15,000 hectares, then it really becomes how do you rotate it that you still make money? And because there is a decline in production when you switch over from conventional through, it's like Dr. Christine Jones from Australia always says, it's like a drug addict that if you don't take him off opium straight away, you've got to wean him off a smoker. You can't. He's grumpy for the first 6 months because he can't have a smoke or a cigarette or whatever. So changing over to a holistic system is easier said than done.
Mm-hmm. It's a painful process to transition to the new system. Yeah, that's really deterrent. And of course, the old system is getting worse and worse every year. And at some point, you can't. And Gabe Brown described that in the farm that he inherited, where he had 3 years of drought, and it was a disaster because his soil had been so destroyed and nothing could grow. And then he kind of had to come out of the ashes, right, and figure out how to move forward. That was a nice story. The way that book was done is a nice story. And it does take courage.
Yeah, it does take courage. I mean, David Montgomery writes in his book Dirt, he actually writes how civilizations crashed because of plowing. Rome, the Roman Empire, I think Mesopotamia, the Egyptians, that was more from building the dam in Ethiopia. But conventional agriculture, if you destroy your soil, you destroy your nation. And that's and I think that is so there's so many resources available to actually change over to regenerative agriculture. And what the farmers are doing, I mean, I've got some clients, it's amazing. We really have clients already that plant soy. Okay, I think 99% of our soy here in South Africa is GMO, but they now already planting without any Roundup, not even a burn down before, not even a burn down before planting. So they're doing the trials of Monsanto now, where they're planting them organically. The guys that really do cover crops and that do animal integration onto their cash crop fields and that. And it's fascinating the results that they get, but it's not easy, and it is. I mean, even in South Africa, we've got unbelievable individuals that really look at how can they do it better than what they did, better than what their fathers did.
That's awesome, and that really is a research task. It's a very challenging and stimulating process to try to figure out how to get it right. And once people do figure that out, they will be able to share it to the whole world, and it's going to be so important. Yeah. You know, these concepts, these basic concepts of growing cover crop in the winter, but also taking the carbon and putting it into the soil is actually very important for climate change as well, because I think that agriculture, our chemical-based agriculture, is a contributor to climate change. We don't know what percentage, but there's certainly a component of it is due to the chemical-based agriculture, because more of the nitrogen and the phosphate fertilizers, get released into the waterways, and the crop, you don't get as much carbon being brought into the soil, and therefore it's escaping as carbon dioxide into the air. But the nitrogen oxides are actually much worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. The nitrogen oxides, and I told you that glyphosate is preventing the uptake of nitrogen. So you end up with a lot more nitrogen escaping into the waterways. And then you have these microbes that grow in the water that end up releasing nitrous oxide, which is like 100 times worse than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. So if you're not using the glyphosate, the nitrogen's getting taken up by the plant. The carbon and the nitrogen are going into the soil, and you are reversing climate change. So I think we would make a big difference in climate change if we would switch back to organic, especially renewable farming.
Yeah, I think the problem really with organic is that you're allowed to plow. So if you certified organic, you can still plow, and plowing is very destructive to the soil as well, to the structure of the soil. You actually Keith Burns of Green Cover Seeds always calls the holy grail no-till organic, where if you get there, then you can farm. You can actually do the poster boy, and it is. What is interesting on the carbon as well with the soil, and that is the higher your carbon or your soil organic matter is, the more water your farm can actually. So you can actually drought resist. You can actually have a drought resistant farm. So
good point. Like a sponge, right? It really holds the water if there's a lot of carbon in the soil. That's the thing. The organic matter is getting destroyed by the glyphosate. So the soil is it washes off very easily, doesn't hold water. So when you get a big rainstorm, you lose all that water. You aren't able to utilize it efficiently. So hopefully, I think it's wonderful. The people who are doing this, like yourself, probably regenerative agriculture research to figure out how to do it right, and then to teach the world, right? Once somebody figures it out and then teaches the world, and then we all get on board, we have to really convince the legislators to reward people for moving in this direction. I think one of my frustrations is that the subsidies go to the big farms that are doing the agriculture all the wrong way, whereas the small family farms, they should be getting the subsidies from the government to encourage people to return to small family farms, I believe.
Yeah. I just wanted go a bit now. I mean, we've spoken a lot about of the farmer and also big ag and stuff like that, but also the consumer, because the consumer must also change his mindset in this whole thing. And I'm actually going to use a Wendy Berry quote where he says, "We are all farmers by proxy." Another thing, just for the consumer, he must actually know where his food comes from. Know your farmer, because that also has a huge impact on you can talk to him to how he actually feeds in it. So it is, I think, really we have to know the convenience of the big stores in it, and their marketing departments are very good. But yeah, know your farmer, and I think that is crucial. Also, yeah, if you think organic is expensive, try a medical bill. I mean, diabetes is expensive.
Right, exactly. That's what I think. People will save the money that they spend in the reduced medical costs, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I just want to close with a quote from Dr. Don Huber, seeing he introduced you to glyphosate, where he writes, "Future historians may well look back upon our time and write not about how many pounds of pesticides we did or didn't apply, but how willing we are to sacrifice our children and future generations for this massive genetic engineering experiment that is based on flawed science and a failed promise just to benefit the bottom line of a commercial enterprise."
That's a great quote.
It is a great quote, and it sums up the whole talk.
Yes, very nicely. Thank you.
Stephanie, I really want to thank you for this discussion. It was really awesome talking to you. Your book I can recommend it to anybody that really that is bothered by glyphosate and also by our big ag food industry. I wish you God's blessings and everything for the future and everything, and I hope that the PR companies actually back down a bit and actually let scientists do their work properly. And congratulations on the book, and yeah, kudos to you for writing it. Really, it is amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it.